Welcome to our grammar explanation video on sentence types. There are 4 grammatical sentence types that we've talked about and need you to know. They are the simple sentence, the complex sentence, the compound sentence, and the compound complex sentence. So if you notice, each one of the definitions ends in the same way. The definitions are underneath here. They all end with any number of phrases. So there are 2 main blocks of building a sentence: phrases and clauses. Clause type affects what kind of sentence it is, whereas phrase type and number included does not affect what type of sentence it is in these 4 designations. So a simple sentence is the simplest of the 4, and it includes 1 independent clause, only 1, and any number of phrases, like they all do. Compound sentence, next, has at least 2 independent clauses, and of course, any number of phrases. So a compound sentence could have 2 independent clauses, or it could have 17, at least 2 or more. A complex sentence will have 1 independent clause and at least 1 dependent clause, and then, of course, any number of phrases. A complex sentence could have 2 dependent clauses, that's why it says at least 1, but it won't have more than 1 independent clause, because then, if it did, we'd call it a compound complex sentence. A compound complex sentence has at least 2 independent clauses, the compound part, and the complex part, at least 1 dependent clause. It could also have 17 dependent clauses and 17 independent clauses. Once you have at least 1 dependent and 2 of the independent or more, you're in this category, and then it could go on and on, forever. Great. All right, some examples. So, simple sentences. A simple sentence will have, as you remember, 1 independent clause, and that's it. Any number of phrases, sure. But here, let's find the independent clauses. The gods fixed the large chain called Gelja to the end of the silken ribbon. The whole thing is the independent clause. There's a subject, there's a verb, there's a direct object, and there's some phrases in it as well. Called Gelja, to the end of the silken ribbon. Those are 3 different kinds of phrases, and they don't affect the type. Second sentence is also simple. Odin himself elected to go to Jotunheim and bring the mead back to Asgard. Now this one's a little more fun of a simple sentence example because we only have 1 subject, Odin. But we actually have a complex verb. We have elected and bring. There's 2 verbs making it a compound verb, but it's still a simple sentence because they both belong to the same subject, and therefore it's only 1 independent clause. The third example. This one's long, so often people will expect simple sentences to be short and, like, for instance, compound sentences to be really long or complex, but the length of the sentence won't really correspond to which type. You have to evaluate what's inside of it. So 9 thralls were working in a sloping field. This is actually the independent clause here, and the only independent clause in the sentence. This long thing, you probably are asking yourself and saying aloud what it is right now. What is this kind of phrase? It's in a positive phrase. And it doesn't affect the type, so it's still simple. Compound sentence examples. So these must have 2 independent clauses, or 3 or 17 independent clauses. So, first one, their interest soon turned to envy, and their envy to energy, for they could not admire anything without wanting it for themselves. How many independent clauses do you see there? We have 1 independent clause, and we have a second independent clause. So there are 2. No dependent clauses. Jilling's wife wept, and sitting in their cave, the 2 dwarfs did not like the feel of the tepid water washing round their ankles. 1 independent clause, 2 independent clauses. And this little thing here, of course you know, is a participial phrase. Doesn't affect the type though. Third one. This one has 2 independent clauses as well. Oops, nope. It has 3. It took Heimdall a moment to adjust to the rank smoky gloom. 1. His eyes smarted. 2. And he retched. 3. So it has 3 independent clauses. And it won't be uncommon to see a semicolon in an independent clause, a compound sentence. It's a good way to connect independent clauses in a sentence, just not to be overused. Okay, complex sentences. So these are going to have 1 independent clause and at least 1 dependent clause. Could have 2 independent clauses. All right, long before early Waker and all swift set off on their journey across the sky, the builder started work. So here's our dependent clause, here's our independent clause, and the type of this dependent clause is an adverb clause. It starts with a subordinating conjunction, can also be called a subordinate clause. By the light of the new moon, he led Svadilfari down over a sweeping grassy shoulder and past a copse to a place where the bones of the hill were sticking out, chipped and twisted. So our independent clause is here, and it continues through these prepositional phrases, and then here's our dependent clause. And the dependent clause is where the bones of the hill were sticking out. Oh, actually, I guess we should take this away and make it here. There's where our dependent clause ends. It's describing place, and dependent clauses that come right after a noun that they further describe and start with a certain set of pronouns, where included, are adjective clauses. So that's what that one is. And finally, compound complex. So they'll have 2 independent clauses at least, and at least 1 dependent clause, could have more. So when he reached some remote farm or hamlet, sowing and salting and scything and swordplay were laid aside. Even children stopped chattering and listened to his words. So we have a dependent clause here. We have 1 independent clause here, a semicolon, often a harbinger of compound sentences, and another independent clause here. So this one is 2. 2 dependent clauses, 1 dependent clause. This is an adverb dependent clause. Makes it compound complex. Next one, C. This second sentence is short, but yet it's somehow compound complex, so length does not always correspond to the type. A shower of rock chippings blew back into his face. Here's an independent clause. And Bulwark knew that Baugi had not, after all, cored the mountain. Second independent clause extends the rest of it, so we need to look for a dependent clause within one of these independent clauses. And we've got it right here, that Baugi had not. And the kind of dependent clause that is contained within independent clauses, oftentimes, actually pretty much always, is a noun clause. It's acting as the direct object there. That is what Bulwark knew. And last, and just as the Midgard serpent waits at the bottom of the ocean coiled round the world, just as hell waits in Niflheim surrounded by corpses and swirling death mist, so gagged and bound on Lyngvi, Fenrir lies and waits for Ragnarok. So we have dependent clause here, dependent clause here, and then we have independent clause here. So where's the other independent clause? So this one is not compound complex, is it? This one is just complex because we have 1 dependent clause, an adverb clause. This is a participial phrase right here. We have another adverb clause here, another participial phrase, another participial phrase, and then an independent clause. So it has a compound verb, but it's not two independent clauses. So this one is only complex, not compound complex. I'm sure you saw that way before I got to it because you're so good at this now. Very nice. And lastly, some 3 to do for yourself. So you can pause it here and decide what you think they are, and I'll count to 5 and then tell you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, hopefully you paused it and decided what you think they are. So the first one, he clapped his hands to his banging head and rode back to Asgard, followed by the Aesir. So we've got independent clause. It's got one subject, 2 verbs, then it's got a participial phrase, but phrase, number, and type never matters. So it is just simple because there is only one independent clause, and that's it. When Thor got to Thrudvang and walked into his own hall, Bilskirnir, the whetstone was still stuck in his head. So here's our independent clause. Here is a dependent clause. It's a compound verb dependent clause, an adverb clause. So one dependent, one independent makes it complex. And last one. He stood his ground and swung his hammer. Not a single monster, not one prowler of the wilderness was able to withstand it. All right, we've got one independent clause here, and we've got one independent clause here. So 2 independent clauses equals no dependent clauses equals compound. All right. So if you want more practice, you can do each of these or any of these things. Write 2 of each type, send to your teacher, ask him or her to check. Second, you can pick a page in the current book you're reading for English or something else. Identify the type of each sentence, check it with your teacher or classmate, someone, and look at the additional notes your teacher provides. Bye!